Well, good morning. My name is Lara Abrash. I'm the chair of our U.S. firm, and I really want to warmly welcome you here today and start by thanking you. It's Wednesday morning, quite early, and you're here to talk about AI. I'm guessing this is not your first conversation this week talking about AI. I'm going to kick it off a little bit, and then we're going to get into Q&A here with our panelists. We're in a really interesting time right now relative to AI, and I'm sure you've heard this all week, but if you think about in the last 1, 2 to 3 years, we've gone from this conversation of emerging momentum, words like that, to talk about where is AI going, and now we're actually at a point that it's expected. I don't have a client conversation where AI is not number one, 1A, 1B, and 1C, and the questions are around what are other organizations doing? How are they scaling? Am I behind? Am I doing the right things? Am I making the right investments? Am I with the right technology partners? Should I be thinking about the workforce differently? So the questions are starting to bubble, and we're starting to see a really wide array of maturity relative to where people are. Our firm did a survey recently. We reached out to over 3,000 respondents, asking them about where their organizations are. And there are a few nuggets that I thought I'd share with you that I thought were really interesting. Probably not super surprises to all of you, but one, scaling AI continues to be a major gap. So you're seeing experimentation continue, lots of experimentation, but companies' ability to go from experimentation to scaled Gen AI technologies is lagging. We see only 25% of our respondents actually thinking that they're at that level. And I would even debate whether someone's self-assessment of themselves actually is, are they really at that level that they're saying they are? So that's a major gap. But they're expecting that to go to 54%. So you hear this energy level that they believe that they can get over the hump. Access is rising. If you go back a few years ago and employees were begging to be able to have access to tools and technologies, but organizations were nervous and ultimately had to decide what was sanctioned. And now when we ask our respondents about their organizations and what are sanctioned, 60% of the workforce now has tools that they can use that are sanctioned by their organization. So you're seeing a big rise in accessibility. Then you have this transformation overlay, which is really interesting. When you think about the power of this technology, you would think organizations would be looking at it and saying, I need to be thinking about breakthrough topics, things that are just things that I couldn't have thought about a decade ago. But ultimately, when you really dig into the use cases and how organizations are using it, you're not seeing transformation. Only 34% of the respondents said that the transformation, again, is driving towards transformative outcomes at their organization. So they're really just scratching the surface on things that probably are a little bit incremental. The other thing that's fascinating is they're not redesigning the work. And this is really important. There's a lot of focus right now on the technology, and we're going to talk a bit today about the workforce, but not enough on the workforce. And if you ask people to come in and do the same things they've done, and then you redesign the technologies, but you don't redesign how they show up and how they do their work, you're never going to tap into that. And our data says 84% of the respondents have not redesigned the work at all. And so that's a big barrier, which we'll talk about, to the ability to do that. And then there's topics that are really emerging. Sovereignty right now around AI is a real emerging topic. No surprise when you hear about the geopolitics that are going on. Companies and organizations are trying to figure out how much can I do without having to cross borders. Physical AI, which we'll talk a bit about today, is also growing rapidly. So we have this amazing set of data for you. In the back, please, when you're done here, there's some QR codes. Please feel free to scan them, and you can get access to this full report, which we're going to cover today. And then over here, I just wanted to point out these very pretty pictures, which actually were done with AI. And these are QR codes. I know they probably look, hopefully they look more like art than QR codes. Although I guess I should have asked you, when you look at it, what do you see, a QR code or art? But if you want to scan those later, you'll get access to our case studies around AI. So let's get started. Super excited. Maybe I'll ask each of you to just introduce yourself, and then we'll get into it. So Alexa, I'll pass on to you.
Thanks, Lara, for having me. I'm Alexa Vignon, so I am the president of global sales for Salesforce. I've been been at Salesforce for about a decade. I was at IBM for 15 years prior to that. Spent a portion of my career about a decade ago actually leading AI product teams and what was not the first wave, but sort of, I guess, the last wave of sort of AI development and adoption, which has subsided, but I think sort of set the fundamental underpinnings for what we see now in the marketplace. So I thought the report was really fascinating, and I'm excited to talk with everybody today about some of the findings.
Great, thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. Quite a nice start of the day.
Yes,
Sun is rising. I have the view on the mountain, so I need to concentrate that I'm speaking.
We gave him a bad seat.
Think about skiing all the time.
Yeah.
I didn't bring my skiers purposely. No, thanks for inviting me. I'm Marcus Hacker, or Hacker, however you may want to pronounce it. I lead NVIDIA's enterprise business in the beautiful DACH region. So this area where we're in is one of the 3 countries that I'm responsible for. Yeah, been with NVIDIA since 2019, so 6.5 years now, joined in August. And the last couple of years have been quite interesting and quite impressive. So I joined NVIDIA before this iPhone moment of AI, as we all call it. Exciting times. We are an engineering company, right? So many people think that NVIDIA is a big organization, but we are actually quite small. It's just 40,000 odd people globally, and yeah, we're actually trying to double down on making AI more accessible for everyone. Also making sure that the growing demand for AI compute that we see is to a large degree done in a sustainable way or in an efficient way. So we're doubling down on making more efficiency, creating more efficiency to AI compute. That's what we live for. And that's where I represent the company for the DACH region. So again, thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you both for joining. Maybe I'll start on one of the data points that I shared earlier, which is this idea of how much of these experiments actually go from pilot into scaled production. In your experience or your views, what differentiates the pilots themselves that could actually go from experimentation to being truly scaled? And what are organizations getting right and what are they not getting right in this area? Maybe I'll start with you, Alexa.
Sure. Thank you. So I think when you read the report, it talks about the pilot paradox, right? Where you often sort of see, and I think there's different reasons that we see pilots sort of struggle. I'll try and ground this in sort of hard data because I think it's helpful to sort of understand the numbers. We have just about 14,000 customers that we have actively provisioned onto our agentic platform. That's obviously not like the totality of the market, but I think it's a good representation. And if you look at that, I would say there's about 3,000, call it 3,500 active users today, and that to me is not an indication that that's part of the pipeline process, right, as we work to stand customers up. But if you look at that sort of bottom part of the funnel where we're trying to take customers, many customers sort of in that bottom layer are in sort of the early, what I would call the early stages of production. So moving to more active use case or more active usage across a pretty broad variety of use cases. And I think that is one of the challenges right now, I think, but also opportunities. And what I mean by that specifically, somebody asked me the other day, I don't see yet super strong convergence around like, hey, everyone in this industry is deploying this use case. You're starting to see patterns. I think service is a use case that people are fairly broadly adopting because there are some fairly like explicit bottom line benefits. But also when you look at the technical reality of implementing that use case, the range of questions and answers that you have to anticipate and provide a system or build a system that is good at responding to a crowd of users is much narrower than, say, a sales use case. So people tend to ask a broader set of questions around something they might want to buy than they do around something they've already bought and need help on, or it's more predictable to understand what they might need help on. So I think, we're starting and we're working really hard to understand, okay, well, where are the patterns? What are the use cases? How do we help people understand what a good and bad use case looks like. And there are bad use cases, and that a bad use case isn't prevalent through an entire industry. I don't think. It's just that for that client at that point in time, given the particularities of their business, their teams, their data is probably the thing that we see most acutely, sort of indicates that like this may not be the right. So we're starting to much more proactively engage around, rather than sort of picking up a pilot that somebody else has already conceived. We're trying to guide people to this is a pilot that might make more sense. And by the way, I think we're learning a lot of things about what works and does not from a pilot perspective. I think the other thing that we see is people, and you talk about this in the report, like the pilot conditions are sanitized, right? Like they're tuned for perfection. And then when you start to sort of look at that across a broader set of enterprise usage or adoption, invariably the outcomes aren't as favorable. And so I think we have to sort of ground people on, when we're sort of building in that initial test case, that's not necessarily representative of what you're going to see kind of right away. And that doesn't mean that over time that condition isn't going to be true. I think almost certainly the results that we're going to observe over the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think will be vastly overshadow what we're seeing, frankly, in some of the kind of pilot or early work that we're doing today. But I think those are some of the things we're seeing. So very specifically, how do we help people find good use cases? Good use cases are oftentimes very specific. How do we do a better job helping people look for patterns? That's an industry responsibility, right? And I think that's why we depend on your partnership to really start to identify where can we help clients in particular, either horizontal spaces or industries grow. And then I think just setting expectations properly, that this is a journey. And I think to your iPhone moment, I don't think, when 5 years from now, I don't think anyone's going to be talking about AI the way we are today. It's going to be a baked in, observable, and absolute aspect of our lives. I think it's the transition through to something we don't fully understand today and don't know how to use completely effectively that is challenging.
This is I think this is a U.S. saying, I don't know, but this idea of like watching the sausage be made.
Yeah.
That's the moment that it feels like we're in, and we just continue to talk about it. But I completely agree. At some point, we're going to be on the other side having a nice meal.
Yeah.
Marcus?
Hopefully.
We call it over-engineering in Germany. We are good in that. No, joking aside, I was going to say, but there is a little bit of truth already in this statement, because looking at the territory that I'm responsible for, by the way, a lot of the stuff that your report brought out in a very compelling and structured way is the stuff that we see with customers that we speak with. And there is this hardly to understand discrepancy between the high rates of companies saying we need to double down on AI. AI is an industrial revolution. We need to really, get our act together to be a part of that and to transform the business towards AI. And there is a very high amount or percentage of customers that share that statement and want to really use AI and are saying we want to use AI in a transformative way. But very little really double down on that. And it's not really, from our point of view, or the way I see it, it's not really depending on the use case, but it's more the mindset of the company. And the companies where we see a really transformational approach are the companies where there is a high emphasis of the leadership team, starting with the CEO, that the company is going to double down on AI. We have some global examples where companies really build meaningful centers of excellence because it needs to be concentrated at one point, right? If you compare it to IT, there is this phrase called shadow IT. Mm-hmm. You can also put that to AI and call it shadow AI approach, that everyone in the company is using whatever sort of AI to do isolated stuff. But companies need to put that down to one center of excellence to really make sure to share knowledge, to make sure that data is protected and data of the company is being treated in a way the company wants it to. I just a couple of months ago heard someone talking about he does customer presentations with company data on, on a free version of a Gen AI app. I'm not going to say which one, but that's confidential customer data and data of the company. It can't just go into an open source model and being used to train the model, right? But if you as a company are not giving the right guidance and the right support to the team, to the wider team, to the company, to use AI in a meaningful way, then you start to see those islands, right? Therefore, I'm reluctant to say it's about the use case. It's really about the mentality and the seriousness of the company's leadership to really double down on AI.
We're talking some of these things. There's barriers like data and infrastructure, but there is an ultimate aspect of operating model, culture. This idea of a center of excellence. These organizations are delivering results today. Many public companies have quarterly results, annual results that they're trying to deliver on, shareholder expectations. But at the same time, they're trying to figure out, how do I become this new organization? And it's hard to do that when you have the same people trying to do both. So this idea of bringing it together, we don't see that in a lot of places. It's really, really insightful. And here's another culture question for you, Alexa.
Yeah.
So I mentioned how many more tools there are that are sanctioned. There's much more accessibility to the tools today, yet we don't see the adoption level still at that. And I gave a couple things that may be driving it, but in your view, what is driving, I'll just say, this lack of adoption, and what could organizations do to drive it?
I'm kind of a dissident on this point. There was an article that ran overnight in Fortune talking about, some of the panels yesterday, and this perspective that in order for it to be effective, AI has to be top down and driven. And it's not that I don't agree with that point. I think people are so hungry right now for observable results, and they're spending, if you look at the sort of capital that they're investing broadly into this space, they're doing that at the expense of some other piece of the operating model that is, hungry presumably also for capital. And so I understand the drive and the impetus for that sort of reinforcement on, is this investment paying off? And I think there is a pragmatism, like as we sort of look now to help our customers drive scale, we do believe like that to see the results in an observable time frame and help them document the productivity or cost, depending on the use case, or both examples that they're observing, that top down and sort of COE mentality is helpful. So I'm not discounting that. But I also believe there's going to be like a groundswell of organic adoption. And I just don't think, because the aperture is too tight right now, that we can see, how the workforce is changing and how people's habits are changing. Like I have 3 kids, 5, 7, and 12. So really the only one who's using AI in an observable way right now is the 12-year-old. But it's an intuitive part of how he works. Now these kids have been on computers since they're also part of like the COVID generation, but first grade. So now you're looking at 5 years, and he wouldn't think of not trying some of these tools as he sort of approaches different things. Like he built an app in Replit a couple of weeks ago because he and his cousin are like getting interested in weightlifting. He's too young to weightlift, but nonetheless, but it's interesting to see, like they did it in a couple of hours using a vibe coding tool. And so I think there will be more broadly based and organic adoption here that starts to show up in the enterprise. And I think that exists already. I think it is purely an aperture problem, and we can't see it yet and fully observe it.
You talked earlier about this, setting the tone at the top. A part of the tone at the top is allowing the bottom to actually express their views, and I think that's your point.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll you sort of talked about this, but this concept of how the employee shows up, how the workforce shows up, and we're not seeing as much of task changing, redesign of work, changing of workflows. I mentioned that. Maybe I'll start with you, Marcus. What could organizations be doing to actually start to move the workforce with the changes that they're implementing from a Gen AI perspective?
Yeah, and probably I'm not the most the most perfect set person to answer that question, because I'm not an organizational or a consulting expert. Let me answer that question and try to explain or to tell a little bit how that works with NVIDIA. Because we actually, we have that situation that it's approached from both sides. We, of course, have a CEO that wants the company to adopt AI, right? I think that's stating the obvious almost. But he is also challenging the whole team on how everyone can adopt AI. So he sends out notes to all employees or to the leadership team and says, look, guys, share on that thread, and that's then a couple of thousand of people on that email thread. Just share with me and everyone how you are adopting AI. Yeah. And then this email thread, people are replying, and then there gets a vibrant discussion, and Jensen reads all the notes. He reads all the notes, and he would pick the one where he thinks this is relevant and reply again to all to keep the discussion alive. And that's then all about people sharing use cases, sharing about what did work, what did not work. That's a little bit of a cultural thing at NVIDIA. We are a very, very flat organization, and everyone is encouraged to have a discussion with anyone at NVIDIA that she or he wants to have a conversation with. And Jensen actually requests that by sending out such notes. And this is really helpful to also get the transparency in the wider organization, who is doing what. And I had some cases where I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we do that also on my team?
Like that.
Yeah, I think this is really top of mind for me right now, because as we look forward, this will be the sort of first year where, and I'm like workshopping the sort of full year fiscal, or the full year plan that I'm about to put forward. But I think this is going to be a year where we've always leveraged capacity to kind of help us drive revenue. That's been sort of and capacity is both, how do we continue to hire and expand our workforce, but how do we also enable their productivity by hiring the best talent, developing the best talent. So that has been kind of throughout my career something I've spent a lot of time and attention on. I think this year we're going to have to think about that a little bit differently. And I think, we'll continue to be, focused on growing our workforce to help drive our revenues, particularly in markets where we see big opportunities for growth. But I want to be very calculated, and we've spent a lot of time with Natalie, who's our people leader, really thinking about how do we start to reframe people's work plans? Like, what are our expectations of how they will use technology? How are we helping drive the change management? How are we changing people's career paths? Like, I think a premise, and you don't have to agree with it, but I strongly believe this will be true, is that as we're going to have to become more sophisticated leaders and understand kind of functions more broadly. And so, if you look at the role of the CRO, I think I have to be even more tightly connected to marketing, to our engineering team and our product organization. And that's not just like a good working relationship. Like, that's a more fundamental understanding of how those departments work. And so on this point, I was with the CEO of Heidrick & Struggles at dinner on Monday night. I've lost track. I don't know what day it is today, but on Monday night, I think. And he sort of talked about, I asked him, what is one of the things that he sees kind of his clients asking him for? And I think this more broadly based talent, where we're deliberately sort of cultivating people who have deeper understanding of related functional roles, is going to be really important. And I think that's going to help us sort of like prime the pump, if you will, for how we adopt technologies, because we're unlikely to adopt them in the stovepipe of the particular function that we serve. We're going to have to sort of thinking about using them sort of more cross-organizationally. And so I think that cross-organizational awareness, the ability to kind of communicate better, and the understanding and development sort of activity is going to be really important as well. And I think almost every organization is thinking about how to develop their talent. I think it is probably the biggest thing we're going to have to change, in my opinion, is kind of how we prepare people to do their work and the tools we give them to be effective at it.
Yeah, I
And
think
we're really early.
and we've been talking for the last several years about you need to have your data ready to be able to use it. You need to have the technology and the infrastructure ready. This workforce piece is the next horizon. If the workforce is not understanding how their job works with the technology, we're not going to be able to really drive the adoption. I mentioned earlier this interesting data point around transformation, and how only 34% of the respondents are actually using the technology to drive something that's transformative. I like to keep things real, so I'd love to have each one of you tell us one example of what you would define as a breakthrough use case that was transformative, that changed the business and operating model, so people can get an idea of like, this can be done. Marcus, I'll start with you.
Fair question. The answer is a little bit harder to give, though, to find this really one kind of silver bullet use case. I think it's not existing because it's very dependent on the vertical of the organization, the way the business is structured, the probably problems that an organization would have. So there is a ton of variables to find that ideal use case. But if you would force me to mention one,
I'm forcing you.
there is so we have that long-lasting partnership, and that's an official case study also. So I'm happy to share that. We have that long-lasting partnership with a company called BMW, who really changed the way they plan factories. So usually there is a certain process how you set up a new factory. So you have different like types and organizations or parts of the business collaborating together, putting that one plan together, and then they start to build the factory. When they planned the new factory in Debrecen, which is in Hungary, that's a completely new greenfield factory for EVs, they first time started to build a digital twin of the factory. Also using AI to simulate a certain set of things that would happen at the factory. And only when they finished really simulating every part of the production process and tweaking minor and major problems that they found, which would have been much harder to correct once the factory is built and operational, then they started the actual planning process with the construction companies and all that sort of companies to really build the factory. And they saved, like, according to BMW statements, already in the planning process, they saved 20%, 20+% of the planning budget that usually is being invested in building such a factory, which is a lot, right? It's not like building a small house, but it's really, especially building a new factory for EVs was revolutionary. Yeah, that actually changed the way BMW is going to plan new factories in the future.
Thanks. I'm glad I forced you to do that.
I forced myself.
I can stick. I mean, I think there's a lot on this topic. Maybe I'll stick with the building example. So we're working with a major home builder in the U.S. This is obviously a tough time for home builders in the U.S. because tariffs are impacting, not to start a conversation on tariffs today, but are impacting, steel and lumber prices, and interest rates are high, which means people aren't buying houses, but inventory is low, particularly for affordable housing. So it's a ripe opportunity with really challenging conditions. People tend to buy houses at night. This is what I learned. I didn't actually know that. And there's like a direct-to-consumer housing market. I also did not know that. In this particular sort of segment of the market. And so you come home from work, people come home from work, and they tend to get on their computer after dinner. So around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, they start browsing for homes. There are no people working at it is cost prohibitive to hire people to be on the other end of a queue, picking up phones, taking calls about houses that are being marketed at 9:30, 10:30, 11:30 at night. And so, we've been working with this home builder to kind of mimic and I think I'm going to come back to mimic because there's a point there I want to make, to mimic the sort of capabilities of their inside sales team that is kind of working on a 9 to 5 schedule, in the evening when their customer demand is really high. And so it's not a case in this particular, like they simply don't have the human capacity. It's not affordable for them given some of the other conditions to bring more human capacity on. But that's a necessary sort of point of engagement for them to serve their market. And so, I think what's been really fascinating is kind of working with them through that process. I think, what I see, and this sort of relates back to our conversation around pilots, like the aperture, the emphasis was originally set on let's solve this problem. But then as we've sort of gone deeper and deeper into like they're associated, okay, once somebody sees a house, how do you go view a house, and all the different role types that have grown up because either you could work certain hours, you were in a certain physical location, or you had a certain skill set. You realize that these are constraints that existed in a world where this technology wasn't available. And so people sort of tend to operate, I mean, this is human nature, tend to operate within the boundaries of those constraints that, they have executed against for, decades or more in some cases. And I think, what we're sort of seeing is we've started to do some of this, we've been working with them for, call it almost a year now, actually. Is that you look at it and you're like, well, hold on a second, like, why are we doing it that way? This doesn't need to be sort of 3 different roles or 3 different agents. This could conceivably just be, kind of one role, because the person who's answering questions about your home, can also be sort of servicing you once you've bought that home and helping you answer questions around, my furnace isn't working, or how do I install new carpet, or whatever the scenario is. So, I think we do see tangible examples of transformation. I do think that's starting to happen. I think one of the conditions that, becomes necessary, and I think clients naturally kind of go through this evolution themselves, is, not just trying to reinvent the process that was, is trying to step back and sort of reimagine what is the process that can be now that, and there's always constraints, like there will be different constraints, there will be costs, there will be, the availability of these services for consumption. So I think the constraints will exist, they'll just be different. And what's the system that we're going to design now that a new set of constraints has been presented, but it is going to ease the prior set of constraints that limited our operation in a prior world. So
Well, you mentioned the patterns earlier, this idea that you hear more of these stories. I mean, for years, we've done implementations of technologies and done a lift and shift. I mean, it's been a shift and lift and shift. I went the right way. And that's essentially the mind, it's an incremental mindset, as opposed to basically going in saying, I'm going to do something that's truly transformative. But it's a change in how people approach it. And there's pressures, right? There's budgetary pressures. I got to show people that I actually can do it. And what you don't want to do is go in for transformation and find yourself with nothing at the end, right?
Yeah.
That's a big risk.
I also think it's worth acknowledging, like if you sort of delve under the covers of the technology more broadly, the progress we made collectively as an industry in 2025 was really substantial. Like you kind of look back to some of the benchmarking exercises at the end of 24 across all the top models, including some of the open source models, and they were pretty good at tasks that had a duration of under 30 minutes. I think at the end in maybe October of 2025, they ran a new benchmark, and now you can see some of the top models are getting pretty good at tasks that can run up to 5 hours. And so to this point on use case selection, like I think this is why you're starting to see like the co-work announcement. I think about the way, I think about the way we launched Slackbot 2 weeks ago. I use it all the time. I don't think it changes the way I work. It's fundamentally changed the way I work. It has given me hours of time back, but nobody's like measuring that. And that's not an organizational deficiency that I'm suggesting about Salesforce. It's just the way I work has changed. I filled that time doing something else. I think I am better as a result of it, but is that measurement being discreetly observed anywhere? Like, probably not.
Right.
Do I think it's transformational? Almost certainly. And I think that's going to continue as the technology continues to mature and the tasks that we can complete with it become more and more sophisticated.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing these examples. Maybe we'll pivot to, I mentioned sovereign AI and some of the data that we're seeing. What do you think organizations should be thinking about relative to when something's local versus regional? And is this potentially at odds with this idea of being at scale and being at scale globally? Maybe I'll start with you, Mark.
Well, first of all, I don't think that this is at all with that global scale, as you said, because it's ultimately down to the organization to decide, and it should be also a per use case decision on where do I want to run it. There is an awful lot of use cases where probably the issue is not so much in terms of I need to have the ownership of my data, I need to make the decision on where my data is being stored, but there is a set of use cases where an organization may want to double down on knowing where the data is. For example, if you look at use cases which contains health data of individuals, right? That's probably the most protected sort of data in the EU and in Germany. So also there is not that everything needs to be sovereign or everything should be global and at a hyperscaler level. But the company or the organization that wants to adopt an AI use case needs to double click on the use case and decide, okay, how much sovereignty do I need? And how do I define sovereignty? What's actually sovereignty? And from my point of view, sovereignty is if a company or an individual can decide on what is exactly being done with my data. Yeah, I'm in full control and transparency on who is accessing the data, using the data, whatever for whatever reason, and I can make the decision whether I want that or not. And again, it's not an easy one, but we see more and more organizations making that thought, and we have great options. We have that great global options with all of the hyperscalers that are big partners of ours, and put our technology to market in a very scalable global way. But we have also partnerships with local providers who are then offering a sovereign approach as a cloud provider. We just last year announced a partnership with Deutsche Telekom where we built that industrial AI cloud, which is a real sovereign option. We are not going to operate it, right? We play no role in operating the platform. But a German headquartered company with German staff would do that, and that makes it a full sovereign option. But there is not, we're not going to say this is the best option or an hyperscaler approach is the best option or an on-premise option is the best approach. It really, and we have a lot of customers that also get our help on that. You really need to sit down and say, okay, what's the use case? What sort of data do you need? Where does the data need to be stored? What implications in a regulative data regulative way do you have? And then, it usually comes to a point where a decision is pretty easy.
I think I would just maybe add, from my perspective, this is a huge discussion right now across all of our clients. We're trying to understand what are the sovereignty requirements and, how do we work with our partners to meet them. I think one of the things that we're sort of thinking a lot about, too, and there's obviously been a huge amount of discussion this week, is, within the sort of context of, if ultimately I think sovereignty exists to sort of protect data of the citizens, and I think if you kind of take that one step further, a big piece of the discussion this week has been sort of responsible AI usage or ethical AI usage, and how do we protect people? And I think there's oh gosh, what's the paradox called? I haven't had enough caffeine today. The Javox paradox, I think, where it's basically like people engage in risky behavior, and the more and more they do it, they become sort of increasingly unaware that what they're doing is risky. And so I do think like one of the things we have to be careful of is helping people be aware as they start to kind of yield. And I do think they will. I do think we are going to yield sort of more autonomy to these agents and assistants that can help us. How do we do that in a way that sort of controls some unintended consequence, which is what I think a big part of the sovereignty discussion is ultimately aiming at. And so, in particular, we've been very focused, and this is not meant to be sort of an advertisement for Salesforce's capabilities, but we've been focused on, as we've brought, Slackbot, which is our version of kind of co-work, that is a file system agent. It is acting on your data locally, helping you be productive. And so we're trying to make sure that as it starts to kind of take on, it goes to a browser, it initiates a payment for you, it takes some, it activates it schedules something for you. Are you aware of what is happening? And in small circumstances, like booking a flight doesn't feel like an overly consequential thing to do. But as you start to look down the the sort of the veins of that use case, you're now in an open domain where you are exposed potentially to threat actors or bad actors. And so I think we're trying to sort of ground people that this is an enormously effective technology, but we also have to help you realize there are considerations, and this goes back to like the workforce development. Have we properly primed people to understand just where there is some risk here? And I think your report talks about this, like more through the context of governance.
Yeah.
Where is there risk? And how do we not to scare people or control people, but to help them make better decisions and use the technology responsibly?
Well, you went right on to my next question, which I mentioned earlier. While we see all this excitement to move into actually using it more actively, only one of 5 of our respondents actually felt like they had the right governance oversight, which is a little scary, right? That we're guns blazing, we're ready to go, but inside we're not really sure we've got this thing monitored. When you think about that, like, what do you think companies need to be thinking about to get that governance organization properly stood up?
I fundamentally believe that's also connected to the center of excellence approach, right? If you have AI or any sort of use technology all over the place in the organization, and everyone basically can do whatever the individual wants with a piece of technology. AI is no different to any other piece of technology in that matter. Then actually you have that non-governance approach to a technology. But if you set up a certain model in the company, not technology-wise but organizational-wise, where you try to focus and double down on that piece of technology in a center of excellence, then more or less automatically you apply a certain amount of governance, because you motivate people also to use that center of excellence because there is a value. There is a value that I get as an individual by going to that center of excellence and getting help to use AI, right? So that can be a vehicle to also apply more governance by providing a value to the individual to use that center of excellence, which is of course then applying also a governance structure. Not sure if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Although over time, it's interesting. You've got the centers, but then you ultimately do want all of your employees to be able to have this innovative mindset, to be skilled, to be able to use it. But early on, to have a way for them to come in and know everything sanctioned, governed properly, it does make sense.
I think it's the Jevons paradox, by the way. I would have got it after a second cup of coffee. Not Javix, but I think we're going to I don't know that I'm right about this, by the way, but I think we're going to end up rethinking kind of governance. Like, I think governance ends up being sort of a proxy for, like, here are all my experience. It ends up being like, here are all the rules, here are all the things you can't do. And I don't think that's what we're going to ultimately kind of actually want here. I think what we do want doesn't mean that there can't be controls, like, or constraints. I think, it's another sort of Americanism, but it's the motherhood of invention. So I think constraints can be healthy. I think we're going to need to think about it a little bit differently. Like, to give you an example, so we are in the midst right now of thinking about, like, I run a sales organization. We're trying to figure out how do we shift our sales team's time to be much more customer focused. And so I don't, like, this data would suggest that they spend 70% of their time focused on internal work and preparation, and 50% or 30% of their time with clients. And I want to shift that, obviously. I would love to invert it. But sort of there is a belief that, sort of 50% or more is a best practice. And so when you look at, like, the things that take time internally, one of the sort of big time consumers is, actually creating quotes for customers. So, like, building out order forms and sending pricing information. If you look at the constraints that exist right now, like, there are constraints on that system today. There's governance, right? And so the governance takes the form of, you don't want to approve. I have to approve everything. So everything kind of comes through as a final if it violates some certain condition. And I get this thing and it says, okay, XYZ is, requires L5 discounting because it's, it's priced too low. I've never received something that says we've priced this customer, ineffectively in the wrong direction. And that is as important to me, and maybe more important to me. Like, if I don't have the value equation right on the other side, I maybe want to know that. I can survive, presuming it's not like below my cost. I can survive with a deal that is discounted too deeply. If I have a customer that's overpaying and it feels, they ultimately sort of feel like we've broken trust or done them an injustice, that's a much harder problem to fix. And so, as we sort of look at this modernization that we're going through, one of the big things we're sort of thinking about is better reasoning engines. And again, I think this is enabled by some of the advances that has happened in the underlying technology over the course of really the last 12 months. Like when you look at the efficiency or the efficacy of reasoning capability at the LLM layer, like I think we can start to think about, rather than setting rules, how do we drive better reasoning to say, okay, we want this particular output. In this case, it's a quote, but it could pricing a policy or a claim or whatever the circumstance is. We want it to exist within sort of this boundary of tolerances, but it's not only the downside, it's also looking at the other side of the equation.
I love that. I love this concept of not just being all about risk. I can't believe this. We're almost at the end of our time. So I'm going to close out with one question for each of you. I'll start with you, Marcus. Both of you have the same question. But as we sit here, you just mentioned what changed in the last 6 to 12 months. When you look to the next 6 to 12 months, what do you see on the landscape relative to AI? What's going to change? And what can organizations do to tap into these changes?
I fundamentally believe that we will see a big, I wouldn't call it breakthrough, but big development in physical AI. All that we talked about on the panel today was more or less around, generative AI or agentic AI.
Yeah.
But we didn't touch physical AI at all, which will be a really big thing going forward. And we also society-wise, we need to double down on that.
Yeah.
And it's simple things like public transport.
Yeah.
We have a big issue already in some less frequented areas, countrysides in Germany, Austria also, where the institutions don't get train drivers or don't get bus drivers, don't get tram drivers in city anymore. I live in Munich, and if I go by public transport, there is an awful lot of advertisement around, do you want to get a tube driver? Do you want to get a tram driver?
Yeah.
Do you want to get a bus driver? And if you look at the demographic situation of the people who do that work, then we are just seeing the peak of the iceberg now.
Yeah.
Right? Because if those people are going to retire in the next 10 years, we all of a sudden don't miss like 10% or 20% of drivers on whatever sort of public transport, but we miss like 60%.
Yeah.
And that could make our public transport system collapse easily. Yeah. So, and that's just one example where physically, because it's physical AI, right? An automated bus or an autonomous car is nothing else than a robot, a very specific robot, but it is a robot technology-wise. And as a society, we need to double down on that and many other things in terms of physical AI to ensure also we can keep the life standard that we have as a society.
I'm just ready for like a physical AI robot that comes in and cleans my house, mops my floors after my kids. Like, I don't, why doesn't this exist yet? I am fully ready for that to be. But I think on your point, and it's a great example, like, I think Germany just had its first positive quarter of GDP growth in a while. If you look at some of the projected stats around US GDP in the first quarter, I think they're projecting 5% growth. I think to achieve this and sort of more substantial GDP gains, you're right, we're going to have to think about, we have the same issue. I live just outside of New York City and work in New York City. We have the same issue when it comes to public transport. You look at the manufacturing industry in the United States, where you have a deficiency of people who have deep physical labor expertise. So I think physical AI, we didn't talk about it a lot, but I agree that is going to be an unlock here. And again, when you sort of tie it to the technology and look at the advancements in the models, and look at the ubiquity of the models, like particularly some of the open source models and their performance relative to the ones that we're sort of more conventionally familiar with, I think it's going to be, have a huge impact on transportation and logistics in particular, which I think and again, not to like wander into a conversation about, kind of the human versus AI debate, but I think my belief is, kind of over the fullness of time, that will be complementary to what I agree is a workforce that has gaps, particular gaps right now, and hopefully accretive to an economy that can grow faster everywhere.
It's not about getting rid of jobs that people want to do. It's rather creating a possibility to get jobs done that nobody wants to do anymore going forward. That's how we need to think about it.
Or we don't have the people with the skills to do, for better or for worse. We just haven't built that in the workforce in the last 2 decades.
We could have a whole conversation about the long-term workforce implications, because I do think that is still an unknown. There may not be jobs that people want to do, but there are jobs that are keeping people paid. They're giving them meaning and purpose. And once that goes away, what do? I guess we all hang out by the pool. Next year, we'll have 3 bots up here doing this panel.
Or go skiing.
Yes, or we'll be skiing.
Not the right weather for pool, but probably for skiing.
I want to thank you both. We will do our best to create patterns and pattern recognition. I want to thank all of you for joining again super early this morning. Be safe, enjoy the rest of your Davos, and enjoy your time here at our Deloitte House. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Really great to see everybody here in person and online. My name is Beth McGrath, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting today's panel focused on connecting for competitiveness, uniting infrastructure, energy, and resource investments for economic transformation. In my spare time, I have the both honor and pleasure of leading Deloitte's government business globally. Also spent many, many years working for the U.S. Government, primarily in the U.S. Defense Department. And I don't think I've ever talked about infrastructure so much in my life than in the last probably year and a half. And if I'm honest, I would say I'm not sure I was as interested in it previously. I'll just say as I am now. And what has been fascinating is to watch what I'll call the transformation of what we all mean by infrastructure, and how important it is from a variety of facets. we have an amazing panel, and I'll get to, I'll say quick introductions in a second, but just maybe a minute of reflection. As I mentioned, we're going from what was, I think, considered more of a really a sort of what are the things that are the basics or the basis for our daily execution, be it from energy infrastructure to compute infrastructure, really was sort of not very exciting. But as I mentioned, I spent many years working for the Defense Department, and I look at how critical infrastructure is to everything we do. And I'm looking at from national security, again, there's traditional defense capabilities, very sort of tactical, sort of the aircraft and land-based, sea-based capabilities. But then we also look at, energy security, economic security, social cohesion, really critical infrastructure, energy. How do all these things fit together to enable not just national security, but, as I mentioned, social cohesion and really stability for nations and for allies and partners. And so and then pile on all of what's happening from a data center infrastructure, all the energy that's needed for it, it just goes on. And the other aspect is all of these things aren't done by government or industry alone. It is a partnership between government and industry to get these things done, because many times industry is on the front lines of, I'll say, non-kinetic intrusion, unwelcome intrusion, if you will, from either energy companies or shipping lines. And so that really has highlighted the need for government and industry to work not just together, but really at the core of what we do as nations and as allies, really defending democracy. So who knew this was going right to democracy at the beginning of, I'm sure the panelists are like, where is she going? So with that, let me do a quick introduction here of our panelists, because I'm super excited, and we have I'll say, quite a breadth of experience and knowledge here. I'll start to my left. Agustin Delgado Martin is the Global Director of Innovation and Environment at Iberdrola, a global leader in energy and leading the wind power across the world. He's also responsible for venture capital program, and that will Iberdrola's venture capital program. Again, we'll get to how do we pay for all these things, in addition to how do we partner. Next to Agustin is Jennifer Holmgren, a chemist by trade who specializes in chemical technologies and fuels research. Fascinating. I just in speaking with her, I felt I was in a master class, most of which I didn't understand. She serves as the CEO of LanzaTech, who is driving the circular carbon economy by capturing carbon to create new products and materials. And I think she brought a little show and tell that she'll get to. And next to Jennifer is Konstantin Chezik, who right now is at Hillmont Partners and specializes in investments in energy and international cooperation. He's previously served as a director of Deputy Minister of Energy and Ecology in Ukraine, and also as the head of the Investment Promotion Office working for the President of Ukraine. And last but absolutely not least is my partner in crime, Andrew Swart, who leads Deloitte's Global Energy Resources and Industrials practice. He doesn't look it, but he's got over 30 years of experience in energy, chemicals, mining, metals, power utility, and industrials, also an engineer by background. So quite the panel. Our plan is I'll ask you a few questions. I do hope to turn things over to the audience for you to also ask questions. If you have a burning question as we go through, please let me know, because that would be great. So maybe, Konstantin, I'm going to start with you. I talked a little bit about partnerships and having you with both your government and industry experience. What does it take for governments to really work together with the private sector, and also talk a little bit about sort of time horizons and speed. So there's a lot of demand for infrastructure. We talked a little bit about financing. Where does the money come from? But also how do we do it in a little more rapid fashion?
Absolutely. That's a brilliant question. And from the personal experience, I'm going to start with mistakes made so that others don't necessarily have to repeat them. So Ukraine had to learn it the hard way that infrastructure protection should be a priority all the day, all time, all day. And something that we've been seeing in the last 12 to 14 months in Europe specifically, including in Spain and Portugal, France, Italy, Nordic countries with massive blackouts, whether a coincidence or not, I'll leave it up to you to judge, but nonetheless, it raises definitely the question of the grid stability, grid safety, and the way we approach it from the very beginning. So point number one, answering your question, would be understanding the reality that we're living in right now. It's changed. It's not the reality we've been living in for the past decades, and that's super basic for many people here in that room, but for many governments and many energy companies, not necessarily so point. Understanding that is a very prerequisite for then developing the right strategy and vision. In order to implement the strategy in a timely manner, one should understand what the strategy should be in response to the real-time situation and threats. And these threats are there. And I'm here not to tell you that it's all bad, but on the contrary, to say that with those threats, the opportunity comes. And here with the threats comes the opportunity for further investments, further growth, and further markets that not necessarily were as developed or even existing. And that is, for example, the market of grid safety, grid stability, and protecting it from cyber threats. With that comes a whole separate additional, but no less crucial, market of psychological resiliency of the people, of the staff within the companies. And the last point would be the proper coordination within the government, with the business, and with the respective authorities, so that there is both a clear vision and strategy, but at the same time, a diversified and potentially even gamified, and I'm going to come to that later, approach on how you implement it.
Great. And I might ask you, when you look at me, I don't think the audience can hear you so well, so as much as I appreciate if you just, so they can hear these great answers. So maybe then, Jennifer, going to you. We talked a little bit, and Constantine highlighted this sort of today's reality is very different than sort of where things were yesterday, and the acute threats there in Ukraine, and again, how do we pay for these? But also, how do we still, I'll say, maintain a focus on sustainability, and I'll call it green. And so from your perspective, this collaboration between governments and private sector to support this new industrial processes, both from a systems approach and to drive value. Mm-hmm. So how do you view that whole perspective on sort of bringing these two things together?
First of all, I think governments have a massive role to play in developing new technologies. They can actually slow them down, or they can accelerate them. To accelerate them, we really need to focus on technology-neutral standards. It's very simple to focus on a path that already exists and to incentivize it. What that does is it prevents new ideas from having a seat at the table. And then by the time they get a seat at the table, it's already slowed the whole system down. So technology neutrality is important. If you talk about standards, I realize that the new bioeconomy or the new economy is distributed. Despite that, I think it's extremely important that standards be very similar across the world. The worst thing you could do is have a different standard in country A versus country B versus country C, and then you impede trade. And when you have small volumes, you need to put them exactly where you can. You have to be opportunistic. So governments need to support that by making sure there's a level playing field and also no restrictions on trade. And then the last thing I would say is, when you think about what governments can help you do, they can help with the usual things that you're used to, incentives, mandates to get a new product out the door. But the other thing they can do is focus more and more on first-of-a-kind commercial plants. We focused a lot on technology innovation. How do we get really cool ideas in the lab? But you also need to help ideas go from pilot to demo to first commercial. And so reducing the capital for a first-of-a-kind commercial plant is super important because that will be the most expensive plant. And if the governments don't come in and help you with that high capital cost, you'll never build that plant. You just will never get the offtake agreements or anything else that you need for that. Those to me are my 3 key requirements for creating new industries going forward.
Okay, excellent. And I would offer, if people have comments, you want to pile on to other questions, feel free. Augustine, maybe to you then, taking what Jennifer said, and I'll say again, in my background around national security, I mean, standards are incredibly important for interoperability so that this sort of system of systems can work together, you know, irrespective of what system you're talking about. So Augustine, from your perspective, you know, you're a global energy company driving probably many firsts and probably more firsts. You know, what policy signals or planning frameworks are more supporting for you to then not only grow, you know, your financial aspiration, but also to make the impact that Iberdrola is looking to make?
Well, yes. When we are talking about infrastructure that are going to last for 50, 60, and even more years, right? You need to have, first thing, clear frameworks, right? So it's a clear and stable long-term frameworks, so you can do the investment that will last for so many years, right? This is very important. You need the stability to run this. And somehow the regulators in many countries and policymakers in this sector understand that. But sometimes we have seen policies that are back and forward. Let's do that. Let's come back. And this is like creating a kind of instability. And so first thing is that. Second thing, it is good planification, right? You have to think forward what is going to be the demand that you're going to have, and then plan in advance. So what you cannot do, it is to suddenly we are having millions of electric vehicles or data centers or whatever, and then where is the network? No, you have to look forward what is going to be, and then somehow apply this planification to building the infrastructure in advance. So we have seen in the recent years that cost control has somehow win over this planification, right? But sometimes it's worthwhile to invest in advance so you have everything ready when this demand comes. And this is good because there are some non-regret decisions that you're going to take. It is clear that, and the International Energy Agency said so, we are getting into the age of electricity, right? So you are not going to be mistaken if you invest in networks or in more capacity for the power lines, because we are shifting little by little from fossil fuels to electricity. And I would say 21st century industries are running on electricity. We can see we are all the time looking for a plug to charge our things, right? So I think this is very important. And then it is not just this planification or clear stability. You have to make it attractive for money to come in and invest, right? It is not, okay, we will give you so few money that the money will go to somewhere else, right? So we have seen that many countries are understanding that, and we have seen an increase on the regulatory, let's say, frameworks in the US or in the UK, and we are somehow seeing also a competition for the supply chain and capacities in the world.
Exactly.
That is good. Why? Because if you look at what is going to be needed for this transformation, and what are the capacities in the world, from mining to building equipment to workforce and skills and everything, we are very below what we need. So increasing the competition, increasing this business attractiveness, will somehow pull from the whole supply chain and increase those capacities that are going to be needed, right? Well, I will leave it here.
Andrew, did you want to pile on?
Yeah. I think a couple of thoughts here. So if I build on what Augustine has said, the way that I think about infrastructure investments more broadly, and whether or not that is electrical infrastructure, whether or not that's port, roads, etc., I think there are a lot of examples, good examples around the world where that infrastructure has served a role as a platform for economic growth, where it is not just single usage, single purpose infrastructure, but multi-usage, multi-purpose. And so when you step back from this infrastructure, you think about like big port or rail infrastructure as an example, which has played a catalytic role in a broader economy, where maybe the originally envisaged purpose was really around mining, supplying electrical infrastructure into mining, but that region has actually used that infrastructure to actually drive broader economic development, areas like agriculture, areas like manufacturing, etc., which creates resiliency within the broader economy. And so why I think that's so important, like right now in this moment, is if we look at the different estimates of capital that's going to be deployed in infrastructure over the next couple of years, like you're talking trillions of dollars, right? And so that has a real opportunity to drive broader economic growth, broader economic development and resiliency in many parts of the world. And so how we think about the planning of that infrastructure, like right now in this moment in time, I think is critical. Konstantin had spoken about sort of the resiliency, right now, or, if I sort of think about the technology neutrality that you spoke about, Jennifer, but I think along with that is also having a vision of how that infrastructure is going to have a broader usage within the firm, or sorry, within the particular region. Permitting takes such a long time, and so, utilize or capitalize on that right now, I think is key.
Yeah, and as I've never, I said I never heard so much about infrastructure, nor have I heard permitting as such it's a critical piece of the play. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, I think you used a very important word, and that was planning. And I think what you see today in terms of countries that have moved very quickly versus others that have not is the long-term planning in those countries. The real commitment not to just have a herd mentality, oh, AI is really cool, let's just go to AI, or this is really cool, let's just go to hydrogen, let's just go to this. But rather the countries who have said, what is the objective, and what infrastructure, and what standards, and what do I have to build? Not for 2 years' time, it's not a quick win, but for 20 years.
Multi-generation.
And exactly, and have worked backwards. And now you're seeing the benefits, right? Because they really thought about it, took the time at the beginning, and they're well underway and ahead of everybody else who seemed to be going faster.
Yeah, and I would say not every nation has the luxury of time.
I agree.
Yeah, and looking at Konstantin from Ukraine, certainly this was unplanned. Some of the current activities, the current war in Ukraine, and the infrastructure needs. So there is this balance of, as Jennifer notes, how do you take then? I think it's $5 trillion, Andrew-ish. That will be spent around, I'll call it infrastructure, and then you add all the other trillions from sort of national security and defense, and you say, well, how do you actually organize that such that it's a more holistic approach to things? That's the technical term, and so it really is this, because you've got government and industry with different incentives and motivation, and then there's the how do you convince sort of investment to happen, and maybe Konstantin, with your experience again on both sides of the coin here, what how do you convince I'll say industry and investors to sort of put money to this critical infrastructure?
You know, there's the quote that I particularly like, that it goes both for business and private things, that there are only three things that could change a person. But I would argue that those three things are equally important for changing any culture in the government or company. And that is love, war, and therapy. Well, if
In
you're
any
not
particular order?
that's exactly the point. You can go in any order you want, but nonetheless, if you have to make certain changes, you're going to make them nonetheless, and one way or the other, you'll have to make them. But it's not necessarily that it has to go through war or through crisis. And again, this is just a quote summarizing different experiences, not necessarily with those like emotions, but the point with war, it doesn't have to be a physical warfare. It kind of might be an understanding of a real threat that is there, that might be an encouragement and a signal for both the business, industry, the government, and other sectors. That is really crucial to understand what are we putting our trust in, because when we're talking about years of infrastructure standards, it's definitely important. It's definitely super critical for business to have this like long view of planning. At the same time, it's crucial, where are we heading and where are we putting our trust in that planning, right? Because again, the standards or the approaches that used to work for quite a long period of time, several decades, we have to admit are no longer working. Whether we like it or not, that's just a fact. So do we really want to start creating the plan for the next 12, 30, 50, whatever years that we expect that are going to last? Or should we also allow the right balance of flexibility? Of course, allowing business the right amount of planning so that they could do the right investments and the proper planning themselves. But at the same time, finding this soft spot where the incentive could be not only survival, because I don't want to put it all in dark colors, but also an economic benefit. And that could be, as I said previously, a new market. Because when you said AI, and everyone ran towards AI, people started to understand that, yeah, AI and all that tech requires significant amount of power generation. So we're at least at the level of understanding of that. But there's not necessarily equally as much of understanding that energy has to be stored, transmitted, and safely managed. And that's the crucial point. Because as much of a trust or money we put into AI or other technologies that are reinforcing our grids, whether it's smart grids or something else, it still is the matter of resiliency, and that's the matter of economic profitability. Because you can build the best system, it could be efficient, it could have the long-lasting horizon, but where it faces a hybrid or even a physical threat and it collapses, it's bad for everyone, for government, for business, for the population. So wrapping up, understanding the priority that is not only survival, but balancing with the right governmental and business incentives, making it profitable for everyone.
So, Augustine, given the, thank you, Konstantin, it's interesting, again, the acute situation in Ukraine, you need speed and agility, but you also have to have a long-term vision, right? Because it can't just be always the immediate issue, but there is an immediate issue. And not just in Ukraine, if it's the pipeline, the power grid in Spain and in Berlin. So Augustine, from your perspective, looking at where does the money come from? Certainly, your company is investing in a lot of capabilities, but you can't do it by yourself. Where do you see the partnership that Iberdrola would have with the government and other companies and industries to then really drive the energy and infrastructure where it needs to go?
Yeah, for sure. To build all this infrastructure, you need somehow huge capabilities. In fact, in Iberdrola, in the next 4 years, we're going to invest 58 billion euros in our new plan. 37 billion of that will be networks, 21 billion will be power. And we need, let's say, partners that want to come with us. So what we offer, first, you need to have an appealing business case for this money to come to your projects and to your company and to your industrial project. I think it's interesting to say that industrial project. It's not a digital project. It's an industrial project that will stay there for many years. And as I said, you need these partners. So we have created a strategy that relies on three things. First, it is we are in a conservative sector, so we, for the money that want to invest with us, we offer somehow kind of security and safety, dividends, the predictability in the returns. We are in countries that somehow the rule of law is important, Europe, UK, US, Australia. So we also offer this predictability and stability that I was requesting before. But at the same time, we are taking the opportunity of this changing the energy mix and how we use energy. And we are offering a growth company, a company that is going to grow. We are going to double our regulated asset base in 4 years, and we will do that again for 2030. So with this appealing business case, then you have your shareholders backing you. We made an increase in increased capital last year, and it was very successful. After this increase in capital, our stock increased. This was like, what? Because they understood what we were doing. I had a meeting yesterday with Bank of America. They are willing to lend us more money because they see the story. And then we have partnership with funds all over the world, Norges Bank or Masdar, whatever, that are willing to invest with us in some projects. So you need to not just to say, no, I am a company that builds infrastructure. No, I build infrastructure in such a way that provides attractive returns for whatever reason to you. So this is very important. But for that, there is another two other very important elements of this equation. One of them, it is the supply chain. You need to have a strong supply chain that somehow relies on your plans to build their capacity, long-term relationship with them, so they know you're not going just to pick up whatever equipment, and next year you are going to remove that relationship. It is not this long-term relationship. So very important, the supply chain. And then the governments. We're talking about infrastructure that is critical for countries. Many of them is regulated or is somehow some kind of regulation through the market design, like electricity. So we need to work with the government, understand what their policies are, trying to somehow tell them what we see in the future. It is very important when we do this planning, not just doing the planning because somebody says that hydrogen, for example, is very important, but based on what we called technological trends and physics, right? It is very important to see not what the past 5 years were in terms of our technological capacities, but what is going to be in the next 5 years. So we plan in advance for that. We have seen that we rely too much on lagging indicators to build our infrastructure when we should talk about lead indicators to do so, right? So governments need to understand that, and some of them do. So they really become partners on this transformation, and we somehow follow this policy. Energy policy is very important, and we are an actor inside this. Having said so, we really defend that one thing is policy that is being made by the governments, and one thing is deploying this policy that probably it is more efficient to do it through private business cases.
And do you think that, and this is for anybody, do you think that the government is still relying on lagging indicators, and there's an opportunity for the government to be informed by all the great work that probably all of you are doing in terms of predictive in the future?
I think some of them understand these leading indicators. Some of them somehow are not trained. I mean, this requires a lot of skill capabilities and understanding capabilities. I'm engineer, so sometimes engineering capabilities, right? So for sure, they need to learn from many different stakeholders. But in the end, I think it could be better.
Yeah.
This is my
that's a very safe answer. I'll just say, as a longtime bureaucrat myself, I really do feel that the industry is out there really looking at predictive and where they're going.
That's right.
And I think it underscores the need for, again, government and industry to work together to then design these policies, because these policies are written to drive behavior. And so,
There is one bet I can make, just very short.
okay.
I think electric vehicles are much more, it is a much more advanced technology than internal combustion engine vehicles, right? And if you look at lead indicators, you will see that the battery cost will fall down.
Yeah.
And in a few years' time, you go to a car dealer and the electric vehicle will be cheaper than the internal combustion engine. So what people will decide, okay, we can see what happened in Norway, that people decide for electric. So we're in the middle of that situation. So you can say, no, but electric vehicles only have an autonomy of 200 kilometers, they're very expensive. This is a lagging indicator.
Yeah, exactly.
If you look at forward looking, it is like, no, they are going to cost less. The running electric vehicle, for example, in Spain is €2 per 100 kilometers. There's no infrastructure. We're building infrastructure like mad. So we're in the middle of a huge transformation, and probably we are not aware of that.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Some countries are, but some are not, and it is really happening. And some countries are, in China, 52% of sales were electric vehicles last year. This is the biggest vehicle market in the world. So it is changing.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're in the middle of that, and some politicians are, policymakers are still thinking backward.
But yeah, backwards. Jennifer, you want to pile on here?
Well, no, the only comment I was going to make is it's actually quite interesting, because now we can go back to infrastructure a little bit. You're talking about EVs, and EVs are quickly going to outpace IC engines. They're actually superior. And, when I think about my sector, fuels and chemicals, right? Because petroleum is the densest liquid known to man. What does that mean? That means that we have grown centralized refineries. We've always focused on bigger is better, because petroleum lends itself to that. You can move it around very easily, right? And so we measure all fuels and chemicals by that standard. Are you producing 200,000 barrels a day at one location? Can you produce 200,000 barrels a day at one location? And the answer with some of the things that we're all working on now is that it has to lend itself to distributed production, to a very different infrastructure approach. And we have not built what I would call it distributed infrastructure, because the lagging indicator is to ask the wrong question. Can you make it bigger? The answer is not, can you make it bigger? The answer is, how do we make it efficient in a small way?
Constantine, will you?
Yeah, I would suggest that maybe in different countries and different places, the logic might be business, then government, and then government and business. But what I would suggest that having really strong business representatives here, and knowing for a fact from experience that some countries have initiative going from business, I would encourage finding the right balance. It's okay that a business comes and proposes a new market for themselves, and the opportunity for the government to provide stability, safety for both the market and the other sectors as well. Because again, when it collapses everything. So it might be a right balance of both incentives in creating those new opportunities. And I would suggest that disincentives should obviously go from government to business, but the business might be the one to kindly invite the business to consider doing that.
Yeah. Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, I think specifically with regard to the financing question, I mean, given the scale of the capital that's going in, I think a key question for me is how do you de-risk that capital? And so, I mean, we've spoken a little bit about like long-term planning as one way to actually begin to de-risk that, particularly on the demand side. But I also think areas like, on the resiliency side, I think, Constantine has touched on that. I'd also add climate resiliency to that as well, particularly for this infrastructure. And then I also think, increasingly, you're also seeing local communities actually come in from an equity financing perspective as well. And I think that also adds to an element of de-risking that in terms of creating local acceptance. I mean, there's some great examples in your world, Jennifer, in CCUS of local communities, indigenous communities taking a particular stake in those facilities. But, also pipelines would be another one, and electrical infrastructure. So.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question, and I have a question here.
Hi, good morning. I'm Suyash Agrawal. We're a green fuels developer from India. We're setting up facilities for manufacturing green methanol, ammonia, and aviation fuel. My question is on the recent IMO vote. We've seen that. Do you see that the vote to stall adoption of the net zero framework will constrain investments towards future capacity of green fuels for the maritime industry, and by the shipping sector towards alternate, towards ships that use alternate fuels? How do you see the entire vote, and how do you see that playing out in the upcoming sessions in April and October?
Jennifer, do you want to start with that? Yeah.
Comment on that, sure. I mean, there's no question, right, that the IMO created a setback in the implementation of fuels, and like you said, buying ships with engines that are methanol or ethanol compatible. But this happened in the aviation sector, right? If you look at CORSIA, CORSIA is an outcome of an attempt by the European Commission to implement an international ETS system, right? You couldn't fly into Europe unless you paid a tax, and everybody said, no, we internationally need to agree, you are not allowed to do that, and that's what created CORSIA. Most of you probably weren't trying to do sustainable aviation fuels 15 years ago, so you probably don't remember that. Same thing's happening with IMO. People will always slow it down at the beginning, but just like CORSIA, it will come. And so the question is, does what happened this year, well, it was been last year in IMO, slow down for 5 or 10 years, or is it just something that's going to happen next year? I see a lot of progress, for example, and for me, we make ethanol from waste emissions, right? And we're putting ethanol instead of methanol. We're trying to put that into ships. Maersk hasn't stopped testing ethanol in their engines, in their ships, and so that is progressing. The ISO standards for ethanol in those ships is progressing. So there's a lot of work around what then becomes an IMO standard that is happening and has not been stopped. The other thing to consider is that really you need an offtake agreement. So I know why you're asking the question. You need a 10-year offtake agreement. But what you do see is the voluntary part of this happening, right? You do see the voluntary part. You do see the companies that are trying to do the implementations, and they will lean in and they'll be ready for the long-term offtake agreements because they're going to bet on the IMO happening. Yeah, but this goes back to your looking backwards versus looking forward, right? And when you're trying to get international agreements, it just takes a couple of actors to slow it down. And it impacts our industries. It impacts our ability to build commercial scale plants. But you will find the voluntary markets as well. That's all I can tell you.
Any other comments? We have another question here.
Dirk Nowak, managing partner at SDI. We support companies in energy investments. And in that regard, 58 billion is obviously no small number. Would love to hear a little bit more about that in terms of your participation also in the data center boom / in the US, and also maybe more also on the venture capital side of your activities, what you see in sort of smart grids, digital infrastructure, and opportunities there. So anything you would comment on what excites you about sort of those investment areas would be interesting, Andres, and obviously to everybody else on the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we are taking advantage of this need for more infrastructure for power. As I said, today, electrification rates in the world is around 24%. In China, is 28 and arriving to 35 very soon. So our main focus of investment it is in networks, 37 billion euros in network, mostly in the UK and in the US. Right? Why in the US? In the US, there is the demand has increased 3.5% last year. It is increasing thanks to this data center boom, but also the electrification of the economy. And we have two platforms there. First is a renewable platform that it has a lot of value right now because a lot of these new data center actors want renewable electricity for their consumption, for their needs. And also the other platform we have, it is in the northeast of the United States. We serve upstate New York, Maine, Connecticut, and part of Massachusetts, and so forth. And they are in desperate need of somehow upgrading their networks and then providing more capacity to the network. And the same is happening in the UK. So, as I said, almost 80% of our investment will go to these two geographies. So, data centers are somehow in the middle of the debate because they are increasing the power needs very much. But today, it is like 3% of the world consumption, right? So it is not only about data centers, although, I mean, it is a good driver for demand, but it's about the other uses of electricity that we are having that will bring electricity from this 23% of electricity consumption compared to other energy sources, according to the International Agency, to 50% in 2050, right? So we are going to double in less than 25 years. This is huge, right? And it will keep increasing. So this is somehow the scope. Other companies will do other different things. For example, in China there will be different things. In India, different things. In the Middle East or in South America, we are focusing on this. Regarding the venture fund, we consider our venture fund. We have two different activities. We have the activities of M&A. It is more like how we when we bring together somebody with us, how we do one plus one more than two, right? We have recently, for example, acquired Electricity Northwest. So now we serve from Wales to up to Glasgow. All these, we're the second largest distribution company in the UK. But this brings value to the proposition. And this one thing, and the other thing it is how we use our venture fund to understand, this is very important, as a tool to understand what are the trends that are outside ourselves and can impact our business models. We learned from that PV was going to be the cheapest source of electricity many years ago, so we invested in that, and we took the decision of somehow retire some of our fleet in advance. Coal fleet and everything, because renewable was really being an important source of electricity. And if you get stuck on, no, but I have power plants, coal power plants that have been running for many years and are very reliable and safe, you are done, right? Because there is a new technology that will somehow get your market share. So we need to understand that. And we use our venture fund to understand those dynamics, not only in the power sector, but also in the demand side sector or in other. There is, for example, a company, many of you may know, called Octopus, who is running on an engine called Kraken, and is somehow disrupting the retail. So we need to understand all these kind of things, how to adjust our value proposition and our strategy, long-term strategy, and take decisions before we are forced to take them, right? So this is somehow what we are doing.
Any comment?
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
Go ahead,
please.
please.
No, actually, I was going to talk about power and leaning into power to make molecules, actually. So, you know, the whole power to X, which is something that's flash right now, is real, right? If we can get cheap electrons, you can channel those electrons away from power production to chemicals and fuels production, because if you have enough power and it is inexpensive enough, you can activate CO2. CO2 is at the bottom of a thermodynamic well, and you got to get it out of there. And you can do it if you have enough cheap power. So I think that's super important. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I beg your forgiveness, but may I tell you what we do for 1 second so people understand why?
Oh yes, you brought
Can
us.
I-
This is
I have to take a
fascinating.
moment, and it's. I want you to understand something, because we talk about new technology. All of us are sitting here talking about new technology, and nobody actually believes that anything is actually happening, I think. And so I just want to share that what we do is we can take waste carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, convert it to ethanol, and then use that ethanol as the carbon carrier intermediate from which to make other things. So if you make ethanol, you can make sustainable aviation fuel with just commercialized technology to take ethanol to SAF. Sustainable aviation fuel. We can take ethanol and convert it to ethylene. Ethylene is the chemical building block, which means we can make polyester. The reason I want you to be aware of that is because everybody talks about carbon capture and reuse and carbon capture and sequestration as things that will never happen, just like they talked about PVs as things that would never happen. This is happening commercially. Carbon capture and reuse is happening commercially. It's not an idea, it's not a dream. And so what we just need is more and more and more and more people to understand that there are ways of using waste carbon resources to make products, and that carbon efficiency is a good partner to energy efficiency, and that there is a future where a very different infrastructure where people can use their local resources to make the things they need.
You know, all of you know that we had a very severe blackout in Spain in April. And it was a matter of resiliency, right? We have been running the electricity system in Spain for 100 years. And, well, with less technology, we were able to do things. But somehow we got confident, right? So I think the worst thing about resiliency is to be too confident about what you have, and then suddenly the event appears, right? Now that we have one thing that we did in the good way was that we had a recovery plan that worked very well, right? So in a few hours, well, it was 10 hours, we could recover from what we call a black zero, right? And so recovery, how do you recover after you have an event? This is very important. But then not to be confident and to operate your system having somehow degrees of security. You cannot, because you have the technology, you tend to squeeze your safety numbers. Okay, because this is costing money. So I reduce my safety numbers until then I get to a threshold. So sometimes it pays off to keep your safety. You have to pay for it, although you don't see the benefit. It's like having an insurance.
Yeah.
But everybody understands the insurance. But sometimes we get confident. No, nobody's going to steal my house until it happens, right? Then you need the insurance.
Yeah.
So because of that, we are investing in these resiliency technologies, being like a more synchronous. I mean, this is very technical, but more synchronous generation, more inertia in the system, more storage to support the whole system, new recovery plans that are relying on other black start capabilities, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So we have learned by the hard way what shall be done. And what we are trying to do right now is also to share our experience with other system operators, so they somehow have this wake-up call and increase again the levels of safety and security and get less confident.
All right, so challenge accepted.
It's going to be hard. It's
Happy
going
to
be hard,
support.
right?
Happy to support all the way.
That's what I heard. You know, it's interesting because you talked about supply chain earlier, and then I'll say cost is always a driver, and so redundancy costs money. But what you're talking about is also redundancy from a resiliency perspective, and so it's this constant sort of balancing of sort of investment plus resiliency plus redundancy, national security, energy grid. It's just, it's what is the movie? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
All at once. That's right.
We are there. So Andrew, any comments?
My sort of final comments here would be, and I'm going to kind of pick up on Konstantin's challenge, which I do like. Because I think we've got to recognize that, like the world we're living in right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly from a technology perspective, right? And I think there's a lot of exciting things happening. So, we shouldn't we shouldn't be taking for certainty like levels of chip efficiency kind of going forward. I think we're going to see more and more, energy efficient chips coming out over the next sort of couple of years. I think you're going to see, relative to sort of previous years, like there's a lot more chatter on things like quantum. I mean, seeing the age of superconductors. I think you're seeing a lot of new technologies that are coming online. And how I think that comes back to this original topic of infrastructure is that I don't think the infrastructure over the next couple of years is necessarily going to look like the infrastructure that we've had over the last couple of decades, right? And to that end, if I think about from a planning perspective, some of the exciting technologies that are coming out, I think about the use of digital twins. And so, Deloitte has invested in a tool called Electrified Grid. Like we're able to model distributed energy grids in sort of real time to allow scenario planning, to allow demand model forecasting, and to enable better decisions on the part of investors. I think about tools that, Beth, you and I, our worlds sort of circle around something called harmonicity, right? Which goes into the world of like smart city planning, where you're able to real time be able to put in particular infrastructure modules and utilizing underlying digital twins and LLMs, be able to, predict and look at what the impact of that infrastructure is going to be in a city context and be able to do that real time, almost in a gamified way. So these are very different ways from doing long-term demand planning and long-term, infrastructure planning over a couple of decades. So I think it's also a lot of innovation on the planning side, which I think is also coming to fore, and perhaps this is a good forum to showcase that in.
So with that, I want to thank Andrew, Konstantin, Jennifer, and Augustine for their time this morning, and thank you for your time.